You don't even know your own PIN, Mom. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, choking me slowly. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, just please leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep finding the courage to speak these truths. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 71 years old, I should know better than to let my own son treat me like a walking ATM with dementia. But here I was, sitting in Romano's, Chicago's most expensive Italian restaurant, watching my son David smirk at me across a table laden with $40 pasta dishes and $100 wine bottles that I'd be paying for. Again, the leather booth creaked beneath me as I shifted uncomfortably, my arthritis acting up from the restaurant's aggressive air conditioning. My simple navy cardigan felt shabby next to my daughter-in-law Emma's designer blazer, the one that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The soft jazz playing overhead couldn't drown out the sound of my heart breaking just a little more with each passing minute. David's laugh echoed through the dimly lit restaurant as he regaled the table with stories from his tech startup, gesturing with wine-stained fingers while his wife scrolled mindlessly through her phone. My grandchildren, 10-year-old Sophie and 8-year-old Michael, were buried in their tablets, earbuds blocking out the world, including their grandmother sitting 3 feet away. When was the last time one of them had looked at me? Really looked at me? Not through me or past me, but at me like I mattered? The memory hit me like a physical blow. Last Christmas morning, when I'd spent weeks knitting personalized stockings for each grandchild. Sophie had glanced at hers for exactly 2 seconds before tossing it aside for the expensive gaming console David had helped me buy with my credit card. Michael hadn't even opened his. It was still in the gift bag, forgotten under a pile of torn wrapping paper. The venture capital firm is very interested, David was saying, cutting into his $50 ribeye with the confidence of a man who'd never worried about money because someone else always picked up the tab. We're looking at a Series A round of about $2 million. Of course, we'll need some bridge funding to get us there. His eyes flicked toward me meaningfully, and I felt my stomach clench. Bridge funding. That was David's euphemism for Mom will write another check. Emma finally looked up from her phone, her perfectly contoured face showing the first hint of interest all evening. David, tell your mother about the house. Oh, right! David's face lit up like a child who'd just remembered Christmas morning. Mom, we found this incredible property in Lincoln Park. 6 bedrooms, 4 baths, wine cellar, chef's kitchen. The kids would finally have proper rooms instead of sharing that tiny space. It sounds lovely, I managed, though my voice felt like it belonged to someone else, someone smaller, someone who'd learned to speak only when spoken to. The thing is, Emma chimed in, her tone suggesting she was doing me a favor by including me in their financial decisions. We're just a little short on the down payment. Maybe $70,000, $80,000 at most. $70,000. Said as casually as if they were asking me to pick up a gallon of milk. I remembered the envelope in my purse, the property tax bill for my own modest ranch house in Rogers Park. $3,000 that I'd been dreading paying because it would wipe out what little remained in my checking account after David's last emergency. The roof had been leaking for 2 months, but every time I thought about calling a contractor, another family crisis would arise that somehow required my immediate financial intervention. The waiter appeared beside our table like a shadow, placing the leather check folder next to my plate with practiced precision. He didn't even glance at David or Emma. After 18 months of family dinners here, the staff knew exactly who would be reaching for their wallet. $147.36. For a meal where I'd eaten maybe 3 bites of my chicken piccata, too nervous about the impending financial ask to have any appetite, for conversation that had revolved entirely around other people's lives, other people's dreams, other people's needs. I reached for my purse, a worn leather bag that had been Harold's gift to me for our 20th anniversary. Harold, who'd been gone for 5 years now, but whose voice I could still hear whispering in my ear. Maggie, you deserve better than this. Mom, David's voice cut through my memories, sharp with that particular brand of affectionate condescension that adult children reserve for their aging parents. You don't even know your own PIN. Here, let me get this one. The words hit me like ice water. He reached across the table, his manicured hand already extended for my credit card. That same patronizing smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the same smile he'd worn when he was 12 and thought he was smarter than everyone else in the room. "I know my PIN, David." The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but there was something in my tone that made him pause. "Of course you do, Mom. I just meant, I know exactly what you meant." The table fell silent. Sophie looked up from her tablet for the first time all evening, her young face puzzled by the sudden tension. Michael continued playing his game, oblivious to the seismic shift happening 3 feet away. I placed my credit card on the leather folder and closed it firmly. "I've been managing my own finances since before you were born, David. I think I can handle a restaurant bill." Emma's perfectly penciled eyebrows rose slightly, and I caught the look she exchanged with David, the kind of glance that said, "Your mother is being difficult again." But I wasn't being difficult. For the first time in years, I was being myself. The drive home to Rogers Park felt longer than usual, my hands gripping the steering wheel of my aging Honda Civic as Lakeshore Drive stretched endlessly before me. The city lights blurred through my windshield. Or maybe that was just the tears I refused to let fall until I was safely behind my own front door. My house sat dark and silent on its quiet tree-lined street, a modest 2-bedroom ranch that Harold and I had bought 43 years ago when it represented the height of our ambitions. The porch light had burned out weeks ago, but I kept forgetting to replace it. Or maybe I just didn't care anymore about coming home to light. Inside, the silence was deafening. No voices calling out greetings, no sounds of life being lived. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the grandfather clock that had belonged to Harold's mother. I sat at my kitchen table, the same Formica table where I'd helped David with his homework, where Harold and I had shared morning coffee for decades, where I now ate most of my meals alone, and stared at the credit card statement I'd been avoiding for weeks. Romano's Restaurant, $147. 36 Amazon, David's address. $89.99. Nordstrom, Emma's purchase. $234.67. Northwestern Mutual, Sophie's college fund, $500. Tesla Service Center, 1247.89. The numbers blurred together, a mathematical representation of my own diminishing worth. When had I become nothing more than a source of funding? When had my value as a mother, grandmother, and human being been reduced to the balance in my checking account? I picked up the photograph sitting beside the salt and pepper shakers, David's graduation from Northwestern, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride and possibility. He'd been 22 then, full of dreams and gratitude. When had that bright, loving young man transformed into someone who could dismiss me with such casual cruelty? Or maybe he hadn't changed at all. Maybe I'd just finally opened my eyes. The photograph trembled in my arthritic fingers as memories flooded back like water through a broken dam. 22-year-old David, fresh-faced and grateful, his arm tight around me as if I were his anchor to the world. Back then, his hugs lasted longer than a photo opportunity. Back then, his calls weren't preceded by careful calculations of how much money he needed. I set the picture down and walked to the living room, where Harold's old recliner sat like a monument to better times. The fabric was worn thin on the armrests where his hands had rested during countless evenings, watching the Cubs lose and win and lose again. I sank into the chair, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne that somehow still lingered after 5 years. The memory box sat on the coffee table where I'd left it this morning, a desperate attempt to remind myself that I hadn't always been invisible. With shaking hands, I lifted the lid and pulled out the first item, David's acceptance letter to Northwestern University. 28 years ago, that letter had felt like winning the lottery. My son, the first in our family to attend a prestigious university. Harold and I had danced around this very living room, spinning until we were dizzy with pride and possibility. What we hadn't celebrated was the price tag, $43,000 a year. Harold's insurance job paid well, but not that well. My part-time work at the elementary school library brought in barely enough to cover groceries. But we made it work. We always made it work. I sold my mother's engagement ring, the only valuable thing I owned. Harold took a second job delivering pizzas on weekends, coming home with grease-stained shirts and aching feet. We canceled our modest vacation plans, ate generic groceries, and drove our cars until they wheezed their last mechanical breath. For 4 years, we scraped and saved and sacrificed, telling ourselves it would all be worth it when David graduated and started his successful career. He never once asked how we afforded it. He simply accepted our sacrifices as his due. I pulled out the next item, a faded receipt from Tony's tuxedo rental. David's wedding expenses. Not just the tuxedo, everything. The venue, the flowers, the photographer, the open bar that David insisted was essential for networking. "Mom, this is going to set me up for life," he'd said, his eyes bright with excitement as he showed me the invoice for $37,000. "Emma's family has connections everywhere. This investment will pay for itself." Harold had been in the early stages of his illness then, though we didn't know it yet. He just seemed tired all the time, needing more afternoon naps, moving a little slower around the house. The medical bills were already starting to pile up, but David didn't know that. I made sure he didn't know that. I emptied my retirement savings account without telling anyone. Harold's secret stash of cash, money he'd been setting aside for the fishing trip to Alaska we'd always planned, went to pay for the rehearsal dinner. We never made it to Alaska. Harold died 3 months after the wedding, surrounded by flowers I'd bought with money I couldn't afford, while David honeymooned in Tuscany on my credit card. The thank you note was still in the box, cream-colored cardstock with David and Emma's names embossed in gold script. "Dear Mom, thank you for making our special day possible. We'll never forget your generosity. Love, David and Emma." Generosity. As if I'd had a choice. My fingers found the next memory, Sophie's birth announcement. Pink ribbons and tiny footprints announcing the arrival of my first grandchild. I'd been so excited to meet her, to hold her, to be the grandmother I'd always dreamed of being. But Sophie was born with complications. Nothing life-threatening, but expensive. The specialized formula, the physical therapy, the extra doctor visits that insurance only partially covered. David's new job at the tech startup didn't offer the health benefits he'd expected. "Mom, we're drowning here," he'd confessed during one of his late-night phone calls. "I don't know what we're going to do." So I did what I always did. I figured it out. I took out a second mortgage on the house Harold and I had worked so hard to pay off. $30,000, with payments that would stretch into my 80s. The banker, a young man barely older than David, had looked at my application with barely concealed skepticism. "Mrs. Chen, at your age, taking on this kind of debt, are you sure this is wise?" I'd signed the papers anyway, because that's what mothers do. That's what I'd always done. Sophie's medical expenses were covered. David's relief was palpable, his gratitude overwhelming. For a few months, I felt like the hero of my own story again. But gratitude, I learned, has an expiration date. The pattern was established. Every crisis became my crisis. Every financial shortfall became my problem to solve. David never asked directly. He was too smart for that. Instead, he'd share his worries, his stress, his sleepless nights, until I felt compelled to offer solutions. Michael's arrival brought new expenses. Private school, because the public schools weren't good enough. Music lessons, because the children needed culture. Summer camps that cost more than I spent on food in 6 months. Each request came wrapped in love, tied with ribbons of family obligation and maternal duty. How could I say no to my grandchildren's education? How could I deny them opportunities I'd never had? I pulled out a stack of Christmas cards, handmade by Sophie when she was 6. Crayon drawings of our family, stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "I love you, Grandma," written in purple marker, the letters carefully formed by small fingers. That was 5 years ago. Now Sophie barely acknowledged my presence, her attention glued to whatever expensive device I'd helped purchase. When had her handmade cards been replaced by expensive gifts she didn't even thank me for? The medical bills came next in my archaeological dig through the memory box. Harold's cancer treatment, the experimental therapy that insurance wouldn't cover, $42,000 that I'd borrowed against everything I owned, including the house, the car, and my future. Harold had protested weekly from his hospital bed. "Maggie, we can't afford this. I'm not worth—" "Don't you dare," I'd interrupted, gripping his hand with fierce determination. "Don't you dare say you're not worth it." But the treatment didn't work. Harold died anyway, leaving me with a mountain of debt and a grief so profound it felt like drowning. David had been supportive during the funeral, holding my arm as we walked behind the casket, speaking beautifully about his father's legacy. 2 weeks later, he'd called about a small favor. Emma was pregnant again, and they needed help with the down payment on a bigger house. Just $20,000. They'd pay me back as soon as the insurance settlement came through. There was no insurance settlement. There never had been. I found the folder I'd been looking for. My financial records from the past 5 years. Bank statements, credit card bills, loan documents, a paper trail of my own systematic impoverishment. $89,000 for David's house down payment. $23,000 for Emma's emergency surgery that turned out to be cosmetic. $15,000 for Sophie's private tutor. $31,000 for Michael's therapy after his adjustment issues in kindergarten. $67,000 for David's failed restaurant venture. $12,000 for family vacations I wasn't invited on. $8,000 for Emma's mental health retreat in Sedona. The numbers swam before my eyes. Over $250,000 in 5 years. Money I'd borrowed, saved, sacrificed, and scraped together while living on Social Security and Harold's modest pension. Money that had never been acknowledged, appreciated, or repaid. I thought about the conversation we'd had just last month, when I'd gently suggested that maybe David could start contributing to Sophie's college fund instead of me adding $500 every month. "Mom," he'd said, his voice taking on that patient tone reserved for confused elderly people. "You know we're just getting on our feet. The startup is about to take off. Just give us a little more time." Time. I was 71 years old. How much more time did I have to give? The grandfather clock chimed midnight, its deep tones echoing through the empty house. I gathered the papers and photographs, each one a piece of evidence in the case against my own complicity in this emotional crime. In the kitchen, I made myself a cup of tea, the expensive kind I usually saved for special occasions that never came. As I waited for the water to boil, I caught my reflection in the window above the sink. The woman staring back at me looked tired, older than her years. Her gray hair was pulled back in the same practical style I'd worn for decades, her clothes comfortable but worn. When had I stopped caring about how I looked? When had I stopped seeing myself as someone worthy of beauty, of attention, of love that didn't come with a price tag? The kettle whistled, and I poured the water over the tea bag, watching the liquid transform from clear to amber. Like my life, I thought. Once transparent and simple, now steeped in complications I'd created by trying to be everything to everyone except myself. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea and Harold's old calculator, adding up the numbers one more time. Maybe I'd made a mistake. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. But the total remained the same. $263,147. $250,000. Enough to buy a house, to travel the world, to live comfortably for the rest of my life without worrying about every grocery purchase or medical bill. Instead, I was sitting alone in a house that was mortgaged to the roof, drinking tea I couldn't afford, wondering if my own son would notice if I disappeared tomorrow. The answer, I realized with crystalline clarity, was probably not, unless he needed money for something. I finished my tea and washed the cup, drying it carefully before placing it back in the cabinet. Tomorrow was Wednesday. David usually called on Wednesdays with his weekly financial emergency disguised as family concern. But tonight, for the first time in years, I had a different kind of question echoing in my mind. Was I used? The answer hung in the kitchen air like smoke, bitter and undeniable. Yes. The Wednesday phone call came exactly at 2:17 p.m., just like it had for the past 3 years. David's timing was surgical in its precision. After lunch, but before the kids got home from school, when he knew I'd be sitting alone in my quiet house with nothing but time and guilt to keep me company. "Hey, Mom, how are you holding up?" His voice carried that practiced tone of concern, the one he'd perfected over years of emotional manipulation disguised as filial care. I was holding up poorly, actually. My arthritis had flared up again, leaving my hands so stiff I could barely open jar lids. The leak in my bedroom ceiling had gotten worse after last night's storm, and I'd spent the morning positioning pots and towels to catch the drips. But David didn't really want to know about my problems. They were just inconvenient obstacles to his real agenda. I'm fine, honey. The lie came easily after decades of practice. How are Emma and the children? Well, that's actually why I'm calling. Here it comes, I thought, gripping the phone tighter. Sophie's been having some trouble at school. The counselor thinks she might benefit from some specialized tutoring. You know how competitive Lincoln Elementary is. Specialized tutoring, of course, because regular tutoring wasn't expensive enough. The thing is, David continued, his voice taking on that carefully casual tone that always preceded financial requests. The waiting list for the good programs is really long, but there's this amazing place in Evanston that can take her immediately. It's just, well, it's a little pricey. A little pricey. In David's vocabulary, that could mean anything from $500 to $5,000. How much? I asked, though I already knew I'd say yes regardless of the answer. $3,000 for the initial assessment and first month. But Mom, this could really make a difference for Sophie's future. You know how important education is. $3,000. I thought about the stack of bills on my kitchen counter, the overdue electric notice, the second mortgage payment that was coming due, the prescription medications I'd been rationing to make them last longer. Of course, I heard myself saying. Sophie's education is important. You're the best, Mom. I'll text you the account information. The call ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving me holding a silent phone in my empty living room. No. How are you feeling? No. Is this a financial burden? No acknowledgement that I might have my own needs, my own problems, my own life that extended beyond my usefulness as a family ATM. I walked to my computer, Harold's old desktop that wheezed and groaned with every operation, and logged into my online banking. The balance stared back at me like an accusation, $3,247.83. After Sophie's tutoring, I'd have less than $300 to last until my next Social Security check. As I initiated the transfer, my phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Margaret, I hope you're doing well. Could you pick up some groceries for us? David's been working so late, and I've been overwhelmed with the kids' schedules. I'll send you a list. Thanks. The heart emoji felt like salt in a wound. Emma never called me Mom, never invited me to family events unless they needed something, but she could text me shopping lists like I was an employee. The list arrived 5 minutes later. Organic everything, specialty items from Whole Foods that cost 3 times what I paid for my own generic groceries. Prime ribeye steaks, imported cheese, wine that cost more per bottle than I spent on food in a week. I stared at the list, calculating the cost in my head. At least $200, maybe more. Money I didn't have for food I wouldn't eat, for a family that saw me as nothing more than a convenience service provider. But I went anyway, because saying no felt impossible, because disappointing them felt worse than bankrupting myself, because somewhere in my broken heart, I still believed that if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, loved enough, they might finally see me as more than just a checkbook with legs. The Whole Foods in Lincoln Park buzzed with the energy of people who'd never worried about money. Young mothers with designer handbags debated the merits of different organic vegetables while their children sat in carts loaded with items I recognized from Emma's lists. Professional men in expensive suits grabbed lunch without glancing at prices. I pushed my cart through the aisles, methodically checking off Emma's requests while my own stomach rumbled. I'd skipped lunch to save money. A habit that had become so routine, I barely noticed the constant low-level hunger anymore. At the meat counter, I waited behind a woman about Emma's age who was ordering enough seafood for a dinner party. She chatted easily with the butcher about wine pairings and preparation methods, her confidence suggesting a life where money was never a consideration. "Can I help you?" the butcher asked when my turn came. I handed him Emma's note. 2 pounds of the prime ribeye, please. Excellent choice. Having company? I almost laughed. Something like that. The steaks cost $67. More than I usually spent on groceries for myself in 2 weeks. As the butcher wrapped them in white paper, I thought about the can of soup waiting for me at home, my own dinner, lonely and cold. The checkout line moved with agonizing slowness, giving me too much time to calculate the damage. $247.83, nearly everything I had left after Sophie's tutoring payment. The young cashier smiled as she scanned each expensive item. Having a party? It's for my family. I said quietly. Lucky them. This all looks amazing. Lucky them indeed. I loaded the groceries into my aging Honda. The weight of the bags, nothing compared to the heaviness in my chest. The drive to David's house in Lincoln Park took me through neighborhoods where I'd once dreamed of living, past restaurants where I'd never eaten, through a world of abundance I'd helped finance but never enjoyed. David's house sat on a tree-lined street like a monument to success I'd made possible. The mortgage I'd helped with, the furniture I'd purchased, the landscaping I'd paid for, all of it pristine and perfect, maintained by money that had once been mine. I used my key to enter through the side door, as I'd been instructed months ago. It's easier if you just put everything away, Emma had explained. That way you don't have to wait for us to get home. Easier for whom? I wondered as I unpacked groceries into a refrigerator larger than my bedroom closet, stocking shelves with food I'd bought but would never taste. The house was immaculate, as always. Professional cleaning service, also funded by my generosity. Fresh flowers on the kitchen island, the expensive kind from the florist downtown. Children's artwork displayed in custom frames on walls painted colors I'd helped choose but had no say in. This was the life my sacrifices had built. A beautiful, comfortable existence for everyone, except the person who'd made it possible. I finished putting away the groceries and left a note on the counter. Food is put away. Sophie's tutoring payment has been transferred. Love, Mom. The word love felt hollow as I wrote it. When had love become so one-sided? When had it become synonymous with giving until it hurt? Driving home, I passed the community center where Harold and I used to take ballroom dancing lessons on Friday nights. The building looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier, like a relic from a time when simple pleasures were enough to make people happy. I pulled into the parking lot and sat in my car for a long time, watching couples my age walk hand in hand into the building. They looked content, these people. Not wealthy, necessarily, but satisfied with their lives, their choices, their relationships. When had I last felt satisfied? My phone rang as I sat there, startling me from my melancholy. The caller ID showed my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. Margaret, dear, I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted to check on you. I noticed you seemed a little tired lately, and I was wondering if everything's all right. The simple kindness in her voice nearly broke me. Here was someone who noticed my well-being, who cared enough to ask, who expected nothing in return but honest conversation. I'm fine, Dorothy. Just tired, I suppose. Well, you know you're always welcome for coffee if you need company. I made too much of that coffee cake you liked, and it's just going to go stale sitting here. Coffee cake, made with care, offered freely, shared without obligation. When had such simple gestures become foreign concepts in my life? That's very kind of you. Maybe tomorrow. Of course, dear. Anytime. After we hung up, I sat in the community center parking lot a little longer, watching the dancing couples through the lit windows. They moved together with practiced ease, partners who supported each other's weight, who moved in harmony towards shared goals. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt supported. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator, and my monthly bills spread before me like tarot cards predicting financial doom. The numbers didn't add up. They never did anymore. My Social Security and Harold's modest pension covered maybe 60% of my basic expenses. The rest came from credit cards with interest rates that would have made Harold weep, from the remaining equity in our house, from the gradual liquidation of everything we'd worked our entire lives to build. I was drowning in debt to fund other people's dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was impoverishing myself to finance the comfortable lives of people who rarely bothered to ask how I was doing. My laptop wheezed to life as I opened my online banking again, masochistically reviewing the damage from today's generosity. The transfer to Sophie's tutoring program had cleared. My checking account balance, $247.83 minus the groceries I'd charged to my credit card. I clicked on the credit card account, watching the debt climb higher. $23,147.92. The minimum payment alone was more than my monthly grocery budget. But something else caught my eye as I scrolled through recent transactions. A charge I didn't recognize. Emma's Boutique, Chicago, IL, $847.32. Emma's Boutique. the trendy clothing store where my daughter-in-law shopped for her work wardrobe, a charge on my credit card that I hadn't authorized, for clothes I'd never wear, purchased without my knowledge or permission. My hands trembled as I clicked for more details. The transaction was from yesterday, the same day Emma had texted me about being overwhelmed and needing grocery help. Too overwhelmed to grocery shop, but not too overwhelmed to spend nearly $900 of my money on clothes. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, the numbers blurring together like accusations written in red ink. How many times had this happened? How many unauthorized charges had I missed while being distracted by larger, more obvious requests? I scrolled back through months of statements, finding charge after charge I couldn't explain. Restaurants I'd never been to, stores I'd never shopped at, services I'd never used, all in Chicago, all near David and Emma's house. They had my credit card information. They'd been using it like their personal shopping account while I rationed my prescription medications and patched my leaking roof with towels and hope. The calculator fell from my numb fingers, clattering to the kitchen floor like the sound of my last illusion shattering. I sat in the silence of my empty house, surrounded by bills I couldn't pay and evidence of theft disguised as family love. For the first time in my life, I wondered if I was not just used, but truly, completely alone. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, surrounded by credit card statements and bank records, documenting every unauthorized charge with the methodical precision of a forensic accountant building a case against her own family. 847.32, Emma's Boutique. 234.67, Nordstrom, children's designer clothes. 156.43, Sephora, cosmetics. 89.99, Amazon, shipped to David's address. 1,147.89, Tesla Service Center, 560 21, Morton's Steakhouse, dinner for 4. The list grew longer as I dug deeper, each line item a small knife wound to whatever remained of my maternal heart. They hadn't just been asking for money, they'd been taking it, for months. While I sat in my cold house eating canned soup and rationing my medications, they'd been living lavishly on credit cards they'd never intended to pay. By sunrise, I'd calculated the theft, $8,347.92 in unauthorized charges over the past 6 months alone. $8,000 stolen by my own son and his wife, while they smiled at me across restaurant tables and called me generous. My phone buzzed at 7:23 a.m., a text from Emma. "Margaret, could you pick up Michael from soccer practice today? We have a couples massage appointment and traffic is terrible from Evanston. Practice ends at 3. Thanks." The heart emoji felt like mockery now. I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. For 30 years, I'd never said no to a request from my family. Never questioned, never hesitated, never considered that my time might have value beyond its convenience to others. But this morning, surrounded by evidence of their systematic theft, something fundamental had shifted inside me. I typed back, "I can't today. I have other commitments." The response came within seconds. "What commitments? You never have anything going on." The casualness of the cruelty took my breath away. You never have anything going on, as if my entire existence was just empty time waiting to be filled with their needs. My fingers trembled as I typed, "I have a life too, Emma." The phone rang immediately. David's name on the caller ID. "Mom, what's going on? Emma says you're being difficult about picking up Michael." Difficult. There it was, the word they used whenever I showed any sign of independent thought or personal boundaries. "I said I couldn't pick him up today." "That's not being difficult, David. That's being unavailable." "But Mom, we really need your help here. We scheduled this appointment weeks ago, and you know how hard it is to get couples therapy sessions." "Couples massage," I corrected quietly. Emma said couples massage. A pause. "Right, massage. For our backs. We've been so stressed with work and the kids." "David, I need to ask you something." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, steadier than I felt. "Have you been using my credit card without permission?" The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "Emma's Boutique. $847. Yesterday. On my MasterCard." Oh, that. His voice shifted, taking on the patronizing tone he used when explaining simple concepts to simple people. Mom, you said we could use it for emergencies. Emma needed professional clothes for her job interviews. Job interviews? She's been unemployed for 2 years. Well, potential job interviews. You have to dress for the job you want, right? And anyway, you always say family comes first. Family comes first. My own words, weaponized against me. David, there are $8,000 in charges I didn't authorize. That's not emergencies. That's theft. Theft? His voice rose, taking on the injured tone of someone falsely accused. Mom, how can you say that? We're family. Everything we've borrowed, we're good for. You know that. Borrowed. Everything they'd stolen had been retroactively classified as borrowed. When? I asked quietly. When exactly are you going to pay me back? As soon as things turn around. You know the startup is about to take off. We're on the verge of something huge here. This is just temporary. Temporary. Like the $43,000 I'd lent him for college. Like the $89,000 for his house down payment. Like the $250,000 I'd invested in his dreams over the decades. I'm canceling the credit cards, I said. What? Mom, you can't do that. What if there's a real emergency? Then you'll figure it out like adults do. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the credit card company, but I managed to report the cards as compromised and request new ones with different numbers. The customer service representative was professionally sympathetic, as I explained that family members had been making unauthorized purchases. This happens more than you'd think, ma'am, she said gently. Elder financial abuse is unfortunately common. Would you like me to connect you with our fraud protection services? Elder financial abuse. The clinical term for what I'd been calling love. The house felt different after that phone call. Quieter, but not in the oppressive way I'd grown accustomed to. This was a cleaner silence, like the air after a thunderstorm clears away the humidity and leaves everything crisp and breathable. I made myself breakfast, real breakfast, with eggs and toast and jam, and ate it slowly at the kitchen table while reading the newspaper Harold used to enjoy. When had I stopped reading the news? When had I stopped caring about the world beyond my family's endless crises? The phone rang again at 10:30. David. I let it go to voicemail. Again at 11:15, then 11:47, then 12:23. By 1 p.m., there were 7 missed calls and 3 increasingly frantic voicemails. Mom, call me back. We need to talk about this misunderstanding. Mom, seriously, you're scaring us. Emma's crying. She thinks you hate her. Mom, Michael's still at soccer practice. You have to pick him up. There's no one else. No one else. In a city of 3 million people, with 2 parents who'd been alive and functional for decades, somehow there was no one else who could collect one small boy from soccer practice except his 71-year-old grandmother, who'd been financially supporting his entire family for years. I called the soccer facility directly. Chicago Youth Soccer, this is Janet. Hi, this is Margaret Chen. My grandson Michael Chen is in the 3 p.m. practice group. His parents are unavailable, and I can't pick him up today. Could you please call his father, David Chen, to arrange alternative transportation? Of course, Mrs. Chen. We have his contact information on file. Thank you. It was that simple. One phone call, and Michael would get home safely without requiring my participation in the elaborate family drama that had been designed to make me feel guilty for having boundaries. The phone rang again at 3:45. This time it was Emma, and her voice was pure venom. How could you do this to us? Michael had to wait an extra hour because David couldn't leave work. He was crying, Margaret. A little boy crying because his grandmother abandoned him. Abandoned. For not dropping everything to solve a problem that wasn't mine to solve. Emma, David is Michael's father. It's his responsibility to arrange his son's transportation. You've never acted like this before. What's wrong with you? What's wrong with me is that I just discovered $8,000 in unauthorized charges on my credit cards. What's wrong with me is that I've been stealing from my own future to fund your lifestyle. What's wrong with me is that I finally woke up. Those weren't unauthorized. You've always let us use your cards. For emergencies. Not for designer clothes and expensive dinners. Everything is an emergency when you have kids. You wouldn't understand. You only had one child, and David turned out fine because you could focus all your attention on him. The words hit like physical blows. Only one child. As if my infertility had been a choice. As if the years of treatments and hope and heartbreak had been easy. As if having only David hadn't made me pour all my maternal love into one precious vessel that was now being used to destroy me. Emma, I'm hanging up now. Don't you dare hang up on me. We need to discuss this like adults. But I did hang up. For the first time in my adult life, I hung up on someone who was yelling at me. The silence that followed felt revolutionary. That evening, as I sat in Harold's old recliner with a cup of tea and a book I'd been meaning to read for months, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see David standing on my front porch, his face a mask of frustrated righteousness. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. Mom, we need to talk. I think we've said everything that needs saying. Emma's devastated. She thinks you hate her now. I don't hate Emma, David. I hate being stolen from. It's not stealing when it's family. Yes, I said quietly. It is. He stepped closer, and for a moment I saw the little boy he'd once been, the child who'd run to me with scraped knees and broken toys, trusting that Mommy could fix anything. Mom, you're acting crazy. This isn't like you. You're right. This isn't like me. The old me would have apologized by now, would have handed you more money and begged you to forgive me for setting boundaries. We don't want your money, he said, but his eyes couldn't meet mine. That's good, because you're not getting any more of it. Fine. His voice turned cold, distant. If that's how you want to play this, fine. But don't come crying to us when you're sitting alone in this house with no one who cares about you. The threat hung in the air between us like a blade. Love me or lose me. Fund me or be abandoned. David, I said, my voice steadier than my hands, I've been alone for years. You just haven't noticed because my credit card still worked. I closed the door before he could respond, turning the deadbolt with a satisfying click. Through the window, I watched him sit in his expensive car for a long time, probably calling Emma, probably strategizing their next approach. They weren't used to being told no, weren't used to consequences, weren't used to me having a spine. Neither was I, if I was being honest. But as I settled back into Harold's chair with my book and my tea, I realized something profound. The house didn't feel empty anymore. For the first time in years, it felt peaceful. The first morning without the weight of anticipated phone calls felt like waking up in a different life. I lay in bed listening to the silence. No urgent texts buzzing on my nightstand. No voicemails from David announcing the latest family crisis that required my immediate financial intervention. Just the gentle sound of rain against my bedroom window and the distant hum of Mrs. Patterson's radio next door. For the first time in years, I had nowhere I had to be, nothing I had to fix, no one I had to save. I made coffee in Harold's old percolator, the one I'd stopped using because David always complained it took too long when he visited. The coffee was stronger than the instant I'd grown accustomed to, richer, with a warmth that seemed to spread through my entire body. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the rain wash the dust from my neglected garden, and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd simply stood and watched weather happen. My phone sat silent on the counter. No missed calls. No crisis management required. The quiet felt almost foreign. I spent the morning doing something I hadn't done in decades. I pleased myself. I sorted through Harold's old record collection, finding albums we'd danced to in our tiny first apartment when we were young and broke and gloriously happy. I put on Nat King Cole and let the music fill the empty spaces in my house. Spaces that had felt hollow for so long, I'd forgotten they could hold joy instead of just echoes. Moving to the music, I noticed how my body felt different when it wasn't carrying the weight of constant anxiety. My shoulders, usually hunched with tension, relaxed. My breathing deepened. The chronic knot in my stomach, the one I'd blamed on aging, began to unwind. At noon, I did something revolutionary. I got dressed up. Not for a family dinner where I'd pay the bill and listen to complaints about my inadequacy, but for myself. I put on the blue dress Harold had always loved, the one I'd been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to come. I styled my hair, applied lipstick, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked alive. When had I stopped looking alive? I drove to downtown Chicago to the Art Institute where Harold and I used to spend Sunday afternoons when we were first married. Back then, admission was a luxury we could barely afford. But we'd saved up quarters in a mason jar until we had enough for 2 tickets and lunch at the cafe. The museum felt like stepping into a time machine. The same marble floors, the same soaring ceilings, the same sense of wonder I'd felt as a young woman discovering that beauty could exist simply for its own sake, not because it served anyone else's needs. I stood in front of Renoir's Two Sisters for a long time, studying the way light played across the painted faces. The women in the painting looked content, complete in themselves, not defined by their usefulness to others. When was the last time I'd felt complete in myself? In the museum cafe, I ordered the lunch I wanted, not the cheapest option, not the most practical choice, but the one that sounded delicious. Soup and a sandwich and a piece of chocolate cake that cost more than I usually spent on an entire meal. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, reading a book between courses like I had all the time in the world. Because I did have all the time in the world. That was the gift of saying no to other people's demands. I got my time back. A woman about my age sat at the next table, also dining alone, also reading. She caught my eye and smiled. "Good book?" she asked, nodding toward my novel. "Wonderful. I haven't had time to read for pleasure in years." "Oh, I know that feeling. After my divorce, I had to relearn how to spend time on myself. It's harder than you'd think." We talked for nearly an hour. About books, about Chicago, about the peculiar freedom that came with putting yourself first after decades of putting everyone else ahead of your own needs. Her name was Carol, and she was a retired teacher who'd left her marriage of 38 years when she realized she'd become invisible in her own life. "The hardest part," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee, was realizing that the people I'd been sacrificing for didn't actually want me to sacrifice. They just wanted the benefits of my sacrifice. There's a difference. Her words hit me like a revelation. David and Emma didn't want me to struggle or suffer. They just wanted the financial comfort my struggle provided. They'd never asked me to impoverish myself for their benefit, but they'd never stopped me from doing it either. "How do you know when you've given enough?" I asked. Carol smiled sadly. "When giving more would require you to give up yourself completely. When the person you used to be disappears entirely into what other people need you to be." That evening, I made dinner for one. Really made it. With fresh ingredients and attention to flavor and presentation. I set the table with my good china, the wedding set that had been gathering dust in the cabinet for years, because it's too nice for everyday use. Who had I been saving it for? What occasion was I waiting for? As I ate my carefully prepared meal by candlelight, I thought about all the things I'd been postponing, all the small pleasures I'd denied myself because they seemed frivolous when family needs were so pressing. When had taking care of myself become an act of selfishness rather than basic human maintenance? My phone rang during dessert, a piece of pie I'd bought myself at the bakery on Clark Street. David's name on the caller ID. I let it ring, and ring, and ring. The voicemail notification chimed. Then another call. Another voicemail. By 9 p.m., there were 6 missed calls and 3 increasingly agitated messages. "Mom, you need to call me back. We need to discuss this situation like adults." "Mom, Emma's having panic attacks. She can't understand why you're being so cruel to her." "Mom, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this silent treatment needs to stop. Family doesn't treat family this way. Family doesn't treat family this way." The irony was stunning. I turned off my phone and ran a hot bath, something else I hadn't done in years. I soaked in water scented with lavender bath salts I'd bought myself that afternoon, letting the heat work out knots of tension I'd carried for so long they'd become part of my body's landscape. In the bathtub, I thought about Harold, about how he'd worried, near the end, about leaving me alone. "Promise me you won't let them take advantage of you," he'd whispered during one of his last lucid moments. "Promise me you'll remember that you matter too." I'd promised, but I'd broken that promise almost immediately after his funeral. I'd been so desperate to maintain connection with David, so terrified of being truly alone, that I'd traded my dignity for the illusion of family closeness. But lying in that warm bath in my quiet house with my phone turned off and my time entirely my own, I didn't feel alone. I felt present, like I was finally inhabiting my own life instead of just funding everyone else's. The next morning brought another revelation. I woke up naturally, without anxiety, without that immediate mental catalog of problems I needed to solve or bills I needed to pay. My first thought wasn't, what does the family need today? But, what do I want to do today? I wanted to walk. So I did. Lincoln Park was beautiful in the early morning light, filled with joggers and dog walkers and people who looked like they enjoyed their own company. I walked the entire length of the park, from North Avenue to Fullerton, stopping to watch the lake and the city skyline and the ordinary miracle of people living their lives without requiring my financial support. At Fullerton, I made an impulsive decision and took the L to my old neighborhood, the place where Harold and I had lived when we were first married. The apartment building was still there, a modest 3-story brick structure that had housed young couples with big dreams and small bank accounts. Standing on the sidewalk where I'd once lived, I remembered the woman I'd been at 25, confident, independent, certain of my own worth. She'd never doubted that her needs mattered, never questioned whether she deserved good things. That woman would have been appalled by what I'd become, a ghost of myself, existing only to serve other people's desires. But maybe she wasn't completely gone. Maybe she'd just been buried under years of misplaced loyalty and financial manipulation. On the way home, I stopped at the bank. I'd like to open a new savings account, I told the pleasant young woman behind the desk. One that only I have access to. No other signatories, no authorized users. Of course, Mrs. Chen. What kind of account were you thinking about? The kind where I save money for myself, for my own future, my own needs, my own dreams. It felt revolutionary to say those words. My own dreams. As I filled out the paperwork, I realized I'd forgotten I had dreams. For years, my dreams had been limited to hoping David would call, hoping the family would appreciate my sacrifices, hoping that somehow my generosity would eventually be reciprocated. But sitting in that bank, opening an account that belonged only to me, I remembered that I used to want things. I used to plan trips and buy books and imagine possibilities that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs. What would you like the initial deposit to be? The banker asked. I thought about the money I'd planned to transfer to Sophie's college fund next week. $500 that would disappear into the black hole of David's financial management, never to be seen or acknowledged again. $500, I said, and I'd like to set up automatic transfers. Every month, from my checking to this savings account. Excellent. Building an emergency fund is always wise. An emergency fund? For my own emergencies. What a concept. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I went shopping for myself, not for groceries to feed other people, not for gifts to buy affection from people who didn't appreciate my generosity, but for things that would make my own life more pleasant. I bought new towels, soft, thick ones in a color I loved. I bought books I'd been wanting to read. I bought a plant for my kitchen window, something alive and growing to share my space. Each purchase felt like a small act of rebellion, a declaration that I deserved comfort and beauty and the simple pleasure of spending money on my own happiness. The woman at the bookstore smiled as she rang up my purchases. Someone's treating themselves today. Yes, I said, and the word felt like a revelation. I am. That evening, I sat in my newly comfortable living room, towels in the laundry, books on the table, plant catching the last of the day's sunlight, and realized something profound had shifted. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living in my own life instead of just funding everyone else's. My phone, which I'd finally turned back on, showed 14 missed calls from David and Emma. I deleted them all without listening. Tomorrow, I decided, I would start planning that trip to Alaska, the one Harold and I had always dreamed of taking, the one I'd given up to pay for David's wedding. Some dreams, I realized, don't have expiration dates. They just wait patiently for you to remember they exist. The doorbell rang at 7:23 a.m. on a Saturday morning, sharp and insistent like an alarm clock designed to shatter peace. I was in my kitchen, enjoying my second cup of real coffee while planning my day, a luxury I'd grown to treasure over the past 3 weeks of silence from my family. Through the peephole, I could see them all, David, Emma, Sophie, and Michael, arranged on my front porch like a delegation of emotional warfare. Emma held a bouquet of grocery store flowers, her face a mask of calculated remorse. The children looked uncomfortable, shuffling their feet in the way kids do when they're being used as props in adult drama they don't understand. I didn't open the door immediately. Instead, I stood there studying these people who shared my blood but had become strangers through their own choices. David wore his serious conversation expression, the one he'd perfected for difficult business meetings. Emma's eyes were red, though whether from genuine tears or strategic makeup, I couldn't tell. Sophie clutched a handmade card, probably created under duress. Michael just looked tired. When I finally opened the door, David stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd never been permanently denied anything. "Mom, we need to talk." "Good morning to you too," I said quietly, not moving aside to let them in. "We brought you flowers," Emma announced, thrusting the bouquet toward me like a peace offering from a defeated army. "And Sophie made you a card." 10-year-old Sophie stepped forward reluctantly, holding out a piece of construction paper folded in half. "Grandma, I'm sorry you're mad at us. We miss you." The words were clearly scripted, but the confusion in her young eyes was genuine. She didn't understand why the grandmother who'd always been available, always said yes, always fixed everything, had suddenly become unreachable. "I'm not mad at you, sweetheart," I said, accepting the card. "I'm just learning to take care of myself." "Can we come in?" David asked, already moving toward the door as if my consent was merely a formality. "Actually, I'd prefer we talk out here." The surprise on their faces was almost comical. For 30 years, my home had been their home, my space automatically available whenever they needed it. The idea that I might control access to my own house had apparently never occurred to them. "Mom, it's cold," Emma said, pulling her expensive coat tighter. "And we have a lot to discuss." "Then we should make it quick." David's jaw tightened. "Fine. Mom, this has gone on long enough. You've made your point. We understand you're upset about the credit card thing and we're sorry. But completely cutting us off? Refusing to answer our calls? This isn't like you." "You're right," I said. "It's not like me. The old me would have apologized by now for setting boundaries." "We're your family," Emma interjected, her voice taking on the wounded tone she used when she wasn't getting her way. "Family doesn't abandon family over money." "No," I agreed. "Family doesn't steal from family over money either." "We never stole anything." David's voice rose, causing Mrs. Patterson to glance over from her garden next door. "Everything we borrowed, we fully intended to pay back." "Borrowed." I repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "David, you took $8,000 from my credit cards without asking. You've taken over $250,000 from me over the years. When exactly were you planning to start paying that back?" "As soon as the startup takes off." "Your startup has been about to take off for 3 years. Meanwhile, I've been mortgaging my future to fund your present." Emma stepped closer, her eyes filling with tears that might have been genuine. "Margaret, we never asked you to sacrifice for us. You offered. Every single time you offered." The statement hit me like a physical blow because it contained just enough truth to sting. I had offered. Every crisis, every emergency, every opportunity. I'd been the one to suggest financial solutions. "You're right," I said quietly. "I did offer, because I thought that's what love looked like. I thought if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, you'd eventually see me as more than a bank account." "We do see you as more than that," David protested. "You're our mother, our grandmother, your family." "Then why?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Haven't any of you asked how I'm doing? In 3 weeks of phone calls and voicemails, not one of you has inquired about my health, my happiness, my needs. Every message has been about what you need from me." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Sophie tugged on Emma's coat. "Mommy, why is Grandma crying?" I touched my face, surprised to find tears I hadn't noticed falling. Michael spoke for the first time. "Grandma, are you okay?" 8 years old, and he was the first one to ask. "I'm learning to be okay," I told him honestly. Emma's strategy shifted abruptly. "Margaret, you need to understand something. The kids have been asking about you constantly. Sophie thinks you don't love her anymore because you won't pay for her tutoring. Michael cried himself to sleep last night because he's afraid he did something wrong. The emotional manipulation was so blatant it took my breath away. Using my grandchildren's confusion about adult financial dynamics as weapons against my newfound boundaries. Emma. The children are upset because their parents are using them as emotional leverage instead of explaining that adults sometimes need to make difficult decisions about money. So you're choosing money over family? David's voice carried the particular righteousness of someone who'd never had to choose between medication and groceries. No, David. I'm choosing self-respect over enabling. There's a difference. This is ridiculous, Emma snapped, her mask of contrition finally slipping. You're a 71-year-old woman living alone in a house you can barely afford. We're your only family. Who do you think is going to take care of you when you can't take care of yourself? The threat was delivered with surgical precision. Love me or die alone. Emma, I said calmly, if the only reason you want me in your life is so you'll have someone to take care of me when I'm dying, then maybe dying alone would be preferable. You don't mean that, David said, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. 3 weeks ago, I wouldn't have meant it. 3 weeks ago, I was so desperate for your affection that I would have bankrupted myself to keep it. But I've had time to think. Time to remember who I was before I became your personal ATM. Mom, I used to have friends, David. Did you know that? Harold and I used to go dancing, travel, have dinner parties. I used to read books and take classes and have conversations about things that mattered to me. I used to exist for reasons that had nothing to do with your bank balance. You can still do those things, Emma said desperately. Not when every spare dollar goes to funding your lifestyle. Not when every free moment is spent managing your latest crisis. Not when my entire identity has been reduced to my usefulness to you. The children were growing restless, sensing the adult tension without understanding its source. Sophie had started drawing patterns in the dirt with her shoe. Michael was pulling leaves off my bushes, his 8-year-old attention span exhausted by the prolonged conflict. What do you want from us? David asked finally. I want you to see me as a human being instead of a resource. I want you to call me because you miss me, not because you need money. I want my grandchildren to know me as something other than the woman who pays for things. And if we can't do that? Emma's voice was ice cold now, the pretense of affection completely abandoned. Then I guess you'll have to figure out how to live within your own means. Fine, David said, gathering his family around him like a general preparing to retreat. If that's how you want it, fine. But don't expect us to come crawling back when you realize how lonely your life is without us. David, I said, as they turned to leave, I've been lonely for years. You just haven't noticed because my credit card still worked. They walked to their car in silence, the children confused, the adults seething. As David started the engine, Emma rolled down her window. You'll regret this, Margaret. When you're sitting in some nursing home with no visitors, you'll remember this conversation. I watched them drive away, their expensive car disappearing around the corner like a symbol of everything I'd thought I wanted, but never actually needed. Mrs. Patterson appeared at my side, having witnessed the entire confrontation from her garden. You okay, honey? I think so, I said, and realized I meant it. That was hard to watch. But good for you, standing your ground. Was I too harsh? Honey, I've been watching this family take advantage of you for years. Harold used to worry about it, you know. We'd talk over the fence about how they treated you. He never said anything to me. He didn't want to interfere, but he used to say he hoped you'd find your backbone before they took everything you had. I thought about Harold's last words, his plea for me to remember my own worth. I think I'm finally listening to him, I said. That afternoon, I drove to the travel agency on Michigan Avenue and booked a trip to Alaska. 2 weeks in July, the luxury cruise Harold and I had dreamed about but never taken. The deposit was substantial, money I would have felt guilty spending 3 weeks ago. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The travel agent, a woman about my age who radiated the confidence of someone who'd learned to please herself, smiled as she processed my reservation. Traveling alone? By choice, I said. The best kind of traveling. You'll love Alaska. There's something about all that wilderness that puts everything else in perspective. That evening, I sat on my porch with a glass of wine, the expensive kind I'd been buying for David and Emma but never drinking myself. and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. My phone was silent. No crisis calls, no emergency texts, no desperate pleas for financial intervention. The silence felt like a gift I'd given myself. For the first time in years, I was alone, but not lonely, free, but not abandoned, peaceful, but not empty. I raised my glass to the sunset, to Harold's memory, to the woman I used to be and was becoming again. Tomorrow, I would start making plans for my new life. Tonight, I would simply enjoy the revolutionary pleasure of existing for no one but myself. The sunset was beautiful, and I had no one to share it with. It was perfect. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of the cruise ship Northern Star, watching glaciers the size of cities calve into the pristine waters of Glacier Bay. The sound was like thunder, like the earth itself applauding the ancient dance of ice and time. Harold would have loved this, I thought. But the sadness that usually accompanied such thoughts had transformed into something gentler. Gratitude that I was finally living the dream we'd shared. The woman standing beside me at the rail smiled as a wail breached in the distance. Magnificent, isn't it? Life-changing, I replied, and meant it. Her name was Ruth, a retired librarian from Portland who was taking her first solo vacation at 73. Over the past week, we'd become unlikely companions. Two women who'd spent decades serving others and were finally learning to serve themselves. I was terrified to come alone, she confessed as we watched the whale disappear beneath the surface. My daughter thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Why would you want to travel by yourself, Mom? She kept asking, as if wanting my own company was a sign of mental illness. I laughed, recognizing the familiar story. My son had a similar reaction when he found out I'd blocked his number. Who cuts off their own family? He asked, as if financial abuse was a normal part of loving relationships. You blocked his number? Best decision I ever made. The words came easily now, without the guilt that had once made such statements feel like confessions of maternal failure. Ruth studied my face with the curiosity of someone who'd learned to recognize strength in unexpected places. How long has it been? 6 months since I stopped being their personal bank. 6 months since I remembered I was a person with my own needs and dreams. Any regrets? I considered the question while watching the glacier's blue-white face catch the afternoon light. 6 months of silence from David and Emma. 6 months of not knowing how Sophie was doing in school, or whether Michael had recovered from his adjustment issues. 6 months of birthdays uncelebrated and holidays unacknowledged. None, I said, surprised by how true it felt. The cruise had been everything I'd hoped and more. 10 days of waking up when my body felt rested instead of when someone else needed something. 10 days of eating meals I chose, reading books I enjoyed, talking to people who were interested in my thoughts rather than my bank balance. I'd made friends, real friends, not people who tolerated my presence because I paid for things. There was Martha from Michigan, a widow who'd started a small business making jewelry at 75. James from California, a retired teacher who'd hiked through Europe with nothing but a backpack and unlimited curiosity. Sarah from Texas, who'd left her controlling adult children behind to pursue a master's degree in art history. We were the invisible demographic. Older adults who'd refused to disappear into other people's expectations of what our lives should look like. I had lunch with my financial advisor before this trip. I told Ruth as we headed back to our cabins to dress for dinner. When I told him I was taking a cruise to Alaska, he actually tried to talk me out of it. Shouldn't you be saving for long-term care? He asked, as if the only responsible thing for a woman my age was to hoard money for my own eventual decline. What did you tell him? That I'd been saving for everyone else's future for 30 years. It was time to invest in my own present. My cabin was small, but perfect. A space designed for one person's comfort rather than a family's competing needs. I'd brought books I wanted to read, clothes that made me feel beautiful, jewelry I'd been saving for special occasions that never came. Every day on this ship had been a special occasion simply because I'd chosen to make it one. Getting dressed for dinner used to be an exercise in camouflage, choosing clothes that wouldn't draw attention, that wouldn't make David's friends wonder why his mother couldn't afford better. Now I selected a royal blue dress I'd bought specifically for this trip, jewelry that caught the light, shoes that made me feel elegant rather than practical. The dining room buzzed with conversation and laughter, passengers sharing stories of the day's adventures. At my assigned table, I'd been paired with 5 other solo travelers who'd become my chosen family for the week. "Margaret, you look radiant tonight," said Dr. I. Williams, a retired psychology professor whose insights into human behavior had helped me understand my own situation with startling clarity. "I feel radiant," I admitted. "I can't remember the last time I felt this present in my own life." "It's remarkable what happens when we stop living for other people's approval," he observed. "You've undergone a complete transformation since the beginning of this cruise." He was right. The woman who'd boarded this ship in Seattle had been newly free, but still fragile, still questioning whether she'd made the right choice in setting boundaries with her family. The woman sitting here now felt solid, grounded, unshakable in her conviction that she deserved respect and kindness. "I think I was drowning for years without realizing it," I said. "I thought the weight I was carrying was love, but it was actually resentment disguised as obligation." "And now?" asked Helen, a vivacious former nurse who'd started a blog about adventure travel after 60. "Now I feel like I can breathe again." After dinner, I walked the ship's deck under a canopy of stars brighter than any I'd seen in Chicago. The northern lights had made an appearance earlier, painting the sky in ethereal greens and purples that seemed to dance just for us. I'd stood at the rail crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of being present for something magnificent that no one had required me to pay for or organize or fix. My phone, buried deep in my purse with international roaming turned off, held no power over this moment. For 10 days, I'd been unreachable by anyone who might want to transform my peace into their emergency. In my cabin that night, I wrote in the journal I'd started keeping, another small rebellion against a life that had previously left no time for reflection. Day 8. Watched whales feed in Icy Strait. Learned that humpback whales can live up to 90 years, and that they continue growing and learning throughout their entire lives. I think there's a lesson in that for women like me who were told our growing years were behind us. Had dinner with my table companions and realized I haven't thought about money once today. Not about bills, not about whether I can afford something, not about who might need financial help. Just enjoyed the present moment without calculating its cost. Tomorrow we dock in Juneau. I've signed up for the Glacier helicopter tour. The expensive one I would never have chosen when every dollar had to be justified in terms of someone else's needs. The old Margaret would have stayed on the ship and watched other people have adventures. The new Margaret is having her own. The helicopter tour was transcendent. Flying over the Mendenhall Glacier, seeing the world from a perspective few humans ever experience, I felt connected to something larger than family drama or financial obligation. The pilot, a young man with genuine enthusiasm for Alaska's wilderness, pointed out features that had taken thousands of years to form. "Makes you think about time differently, doesn't it?" he said through the headset as we hovered over a crevasse that dropped into blue infinity. "What seems permanent from ground level looks pretty temporary from up here." He was right. From this height, the problems that had consumed my life for decades looked remarkably small. David's startup worries, Emma's shopping habits, the children's expensive activities, all of it seemed as insignificant as the ant colonies we could barely see far below. "How old is this glacier?" I asked. "About 3,000 years old. It's been growing and shrinking, advancing and retreating, adapting to changing conditions for longer than human civilization. Resilient doesn't begin to cover it." Resilient. The word resonated as we flew back toward Juneau. I'd thought resilience meant enduring whatever others demanded of me, absorbing their needs and problems until I disappeared entirely into their wants. But watching the glacier's ancient dance with time and weather, I understood that true resilience meant adapting to protect what was essential, sometimes retreating to preserve the core of yourself. That evening, at our table's final dinner together, Dr. Williams raised his glass for a toast. "To Margaret," he said, "who has reminded us all that it's never too late to remember who we were before the world told us who we should be." The others joined the toast, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Celebration that had nothing to do with anyone else's achievements or milestones. This was for me, for choices I'd made, for boundaries I'd set, for the courage to disappoint people who'd taken my compliance for granted. "I have an announcement," I said, surprising myself. When I get home, I'm starting something new. I've been researching financial literacy programs for older women. There are so many of us who've been supporting adult children and enabling their financial irresponsibility because we thought that's what love looked like. What kind of program? Helen asked. Support groups, education workshops, financial planning specifically for women who need to learn to say no to family members who've been exploiting their generosity. I'm calling it the last pin. Ruth laughed. Because we're finally using our passwords for ourselves? Exactly. Because knowing your PIN isn't enough. You have to know your worth. On the last night of the cruise, I stood alone on the deck watching the lights of Vancouver approach. In 12 hours, I'd be back in Chicago, back to my quiet house and my independent life. But I wasn't the same woman who'd left Seattle 10 days ago. That woman had been newly free but still uncertain, still carrying guilt about her choices. This woman knew with bone-deep certainty that she'd made the right decision. This woman was no longer afraid of being alone because she'd learned the difference between loneliness and solitude. My phone would probably have dozens of missed messages when I turned it back on tomorrow. David might have tried calling from different numbers. Emma might have sent long texts explaining why I was wrong to set boundaries. There might be emergencies, crises, situations that supposedly required my immediate attention and financial intervention. But there would also be my own life waiting for me, the woman I'd become and was still becoming, the dreams I was finally living, the future I was creating for myself instead of funding for others. I touched the necklace I'd bought myself in Ketchikan, a small silver whale that reminded me of the majesty I'd witnessed and the freedom I'd claimed. Tomorrow, I would start building something new. A life where I mattered not because of what I could provide, but because of who I was. The lights of Vancouver grew brighter as we approached the harbor, but they couldn't outshine the light I'd found within myself. For the first time in my adult life, I was enough, all by myself, just as I was. 1 year later, I stood in the community center on North Clark Street, watching 23 women file into the meeting room I'd rented for our monthly Last Pin support group. They came from different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, different financial situations, but they all shared the same hollow look I remembered seeing in my own mirror, the expression of people who'd given so much of themselves away that they'd forgotten what remained. There was Linda, 68, whose gambling-addicted son had drained her retirement savings 3 times. Maria, 74, who'd been supporting her unemployed daughter and 4 grandchildren for 8 years. Patricia, 62, who'd discovered her husband had been secretly borrowing against their house to fund their adult son's failed business ventures. And newest to our group, Janet, 70, who'd driven 3 hours from Wisconsin after finding our website. She clutched a folder of bank statements like evidence in a trial where she was both victim and prosecutor. I used to think I was being a good mother, she said during introductions, her voice barely above a whisper. 43 years of marriage, and my husband left me last month. Said I cared more about our kids than about him. Maybe he was right. Maybe I did care about them more, but they don't care about me at all. The room fell silent with recognition. We'd all been Janet at some point, convinced that endless giving was the same as loving, that bankrupting ourselves emotionally and financially was proof of our maternal devotion. Janet, I said gently, can you tell us about your PIN? She looked confused. My PIN? Do you know your bank account PIN? Your credit card numbers? Your social security number? All the passwords to your own financial life? Of course I do. I'm not senile. But do you know your worth? The question hung in the air like a challenge. It was the same question I asked every new member, the same question that had taken me 71 years to answer correctly. I don't understand. Your PIN gives you access to your money, but knowing your worth gives you access to your life. 1 year ago, I knew every number, every password, every account balance. But I had no idea what I was worth as a human being beyond my usefulness to other people. I gestured to the whiteboard where I'd written our group's core principle in large letters. Love that requires you to disappear is not love at all. Janet, how much money have you given your adult children in the past 5 years? She consulted her folder with the mechanical precision of someone who'd been keeping meticulous records of her own destruction. $87,412. And how much gratitude have you received? What do you mean? Thank you cards, phone calls just to see how you're doing, invitations to family events where you're not expected to pay, birthday gifts, Christmas presents, any acknowledgement that you exist beyond your capacity to solve their problems. Janet's silence was answer enough. This is what we call the PIN test, I explained. If you removed your ability to provide money, services, or solutions to your adult children's problems, would they still want a relationship with you? If the answer is no, or if you're afraid to find out, then you're not in a family relationship. You're in a financial transaction. Around the room, women nodded with the bitter recognition of shared experience. Linda wiped away tears. Maria clutched her purse tighter, as if protecting what little remained of her resources. But how do you stop? Asked Patricia. How do you say no to people you love? You start by loving yourself enough to require that they treat you with basic human dignity, I replied. You start by understanding that enabling destructive behavior isn't love, it's harm, disguised as help. I shared my own story then, as I did every month, watching their faces change as they recognized their own experiences in my narrative. The restaurant humiliation, the unauthorized credit card charges, the gradual erosion of my identity until I existed only as a resource for other people's dreams. What happened to your son? Janet asked when I finished. Does he ever call? No, I said simply. And that's actually the greatest gift he could have given me. How can you say that? Because his silence proved everything I'd suspected but been afraid to admit. He never loved me. He loved what I could do for him. When I stopped being useful, I stopped existing to him. That painful truth was also my liberation. I pulled out my phone and showed them a photo from the previous week. Me and 5 other women from our group at a wine tasting in Napa Valley. All of us laughing. All of us spending money on our own pleasure instead of other people's problems. This is what freedom looks like, I said. These women have become my chosen family. We support each other emotionally, but we don't exploit each other financially. We celebrate each other's successes without asking what's in it for us. We show up for each other's crises without keeping scorecards of who owes what. But don't you miss your grandchildren? Linda asked, voicing the question they all carried. I miss the idea of them, I admitted. I miss the relationship I imagined we had, but I don't miss being used as their grandmother. I don't miss being valued only for my ability to fund their activities and education while being excluded from their actual lives. What if they change? What if they realize what they've lost and want to make amends? Then they know where to find me. But I'm not holding my breath. And I'm not putting my life on hold waiting for people who've already shown me exactly how much I matter to them. After the meeting, as the women filed out clutching information packets about financial boundaries and emotional self-protection, Janet lingered behind. Margaret, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever regret it? Choosing yourself over family? I considered the question while packing up my materials. The workshop handouts, the resource lists, the carefully curated books about financial abuse within families. A year ago, this question would have devastated me. Now it felt almost quaint. Janet, I didn't choose myself over family. I chose myself over people who were pretending to be family while systematically destroying my financial and emotional well-being. There's a difference. But you're alone now. No, I said, smiling at the profound misunderstanding. I'm finally not alone. For the first time in decades, I have myself for company, and it turns out I'm quite good company when I'm not constantly anxious about other people's problems. That evening, I sat in my renovated living room, freshly painted, furnished with pieces I'd chosen for my own comfort rather than others' approval, and opened my laptop to work on the book I'd been writing. The Last Pin, A Guide to Financial Recovery from Family Abuse, would be published next spring by a small press that specialized in women's empowerment stories. The advance wasn't huge, but it was mine. Money I'd earned by transforming my pain into purpose, by helping other women recognize that they deserved better than financial exploitation, disguised as love. My phone sat silent on the side table, as it had for months. No crisis calls, no emergency texts, no desperate pleas for financial intervention. The silence that had once terrified me now felt like a gift I'd given myself. Permission to exist without constantly managing other people's poor choices. I'd received one piece of contact from my old life 3 months ago, a friend of Emma's who'd seen me at the farmer's market looking so happy and healthy, and thought Emma would want to know. The message that came through this intermediary was predictably manipulative. David and Emma are struggling financially. Sophie is having problems in school. They're wondering if you're ready to be part of the family again. I'd sent back a simple response. When they're ready to have a relationship with me that doesn't require my money, they know where to find me. I never heard back. My computer chimed with an email from Ruth, my Alaska cruise companion who'd become one of my dearest friends. She was planning a trip to Italy next fall and wondered if I'd like to join her. The old Margaret would have checked her bank balance first, calculated whether she could afford it, worried about what family emergencies might arise that would require her to cancel. The new Margaret typed back immediately, "Yes. Send me the details. I've always wanted to see the Italian lakes." Because I had always wanted to see the Italian lakes. That desire had been buried under decades of other people's wants, but it had survived, waiting patiently for me to remember it existed. I was 72 years old, and I was just beginning to live the life I'd always deserved. My phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy Patterson next door. "Movie night tomorrow? I'm making popcorn and we can complain about the ending." I smiled and typed back, "Perfect. I'll bring wine." Real friendship, I'd learned, was surprisingly simple when it wasn't complicated by financial obligation or emotional manipulation. Dorothy liked my company because I was good company, not because I could solve her problems or fund her lifestyle. She called when she wanted to talk, not when she needed something. She remembered my birthday and genuinely cared about my answer when she asked how I was doing. It was revolutionary to be valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught my reflection in Harold's old dresser mirror. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the defeated, anxious person who'd sat crying in this same room over stolen credit card statements. This woman stood straighter, smiled more easily, looked directly at the camera instead of trying to fade into the background. Her clothes fit properly because she'd bought them in her actual size, instead of hiding in shapeless garments chosen to avoid drawing attention. Her hair was styled because she'd found a salon she enjoyed visiting, run by a woman who chatted about books and travel instead of just cutting hair in efficient silence. This woman looked like someone who mattered because she finally believed she did. I picked up the photograph that still sat on Harold's dresser, our wedding picture from 48 years ago. We'd been so young, so certain that love meant total sacrifice, complete devotion, endless giving. "I finally figured it out," I whispered to his image. "Love isn't about disappearing into someone else's needs. It's about being valued for who you are, not just what you can provide." I imagined he would have been proud of the woman I'd become. Harold had loved me not for my usefulness, but for my laughter, my curiosity, my dreams. He'd never asked me to make myself smaller so he could feel bigger. Why had I accepted so much less from his son? The answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I'd finally remembered what Harold had always known. I was enough, exactly as I was, without needing to prove my worth through financial sacrifice. Tomorrow, I would wake up in my own life, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being. I would make choices based on my own desires rather than other people's emergencies. I would spend my money on experiences that brought me joy instead of problems that weren't mine to solve. At 72, I was finally learning to live like someone who mattered, because I do matter. And if you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in my pain, then you matter too. Have you ever felt like your worth was measured only by what you could give or provide to others? Have you ever found yourself financially supporting people who never seemed to support you emotionally in return? Tell me about it in the comments below. Your story matters, and sharing it might help someone else realize they're not alone in feeling used and undervalued. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to this channel. These stories need to reach the people who need to hear them, the ones who've forgotten that love shouldn't cost everything you have to give.